Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Last month, Suchitra Vijayan, a barrister, put out a video detailing hate speech in the Indian media and the concept of journalism as genocide. As Ms. Vijayan says, as a young lawyer, she worked for the war crimes tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. We tried to get her to be on this program but could not reach her despite many attempts. This also means that we cannot, unfortunately, run parts of her video because of copyright issues. But let me put here a brief, rough transcript of what she said. She began by referring to the Human Rights Watch report about protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act and attacks on Muslims. And she said, I urge journalists in India to read it carefully and report the contents of the report. She then talked about an Indian media anchor, Rahul Kamal, and his reporting, but said that he wasn't the only one spewing hate when reporting about Muslims. She then walks the viewers through the idea of journalism as genocide and what that really means. And here begins the rough transcript. In 2003, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda named 3 Rwandan journalists and said they were guilty of genocide, incitement to genocide, conspiracy, and crimes against humanity. The tribunal raised some very important questions regarding the role of media and, more crucially, the idea of accountability. When do journalists, especially those who spew hate, become accountable for what they are doing or have done? Since the Nuremberg trials, hate speech has been prosecuted as a war crime, and the way journalists in Rwanda had acted actually constituted this idea of journalism as genocide. As a Rwandan anthropologist's fieldwork and testimonies from genocide perpetrators indicate, hate messages from the media greatly help in dehumanizing a population and making it vulnerable. This is not very different from what's happening in India. The media provides the background score to the state's dispensation of arbitrary authority. The journalists became both the petty sovereigns of the state and its useful idiots. You're absolutely right, she said. I'm calling Rahul Kamal a useful idiot. But don't forget that bigotry is big business. It's not that these people are inherently bigots who can speak good English, but they also make money out of hate. The video is 12 minutes long, but I think this just will do. It is a known fact that a number of highly rated Indian anchors regularly spew hate against Indian Muslims, as also the occupied Muslim population of Kashmir. I mention these 2 categories because these 2 categories are different. They do this on the big screen as well as on social media platforms, lying, dissembling, and presenting the RSS agenda with not a shred of moral remorse because, as Ms. Vijayan said, bigotry is big business. So while the world is grappling with COVID-19 virus, India's body politic is afflicted with the Hindutva virus, fed by a fascist government and aided by what Ms. Vijayan says are state's useful idiots. But let's dive right into this. We are joined today by Ruwa Shah, who's a journalist based in Turkey but belongs to Indian occupied and now annexed Kashmir. Alia Iftikhar, who's a senior researcher for Committee to Protect Journalists, joins me from Sydney. Thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Alia here. Alia, last time I had you on my program, we were again talking about what the CPJ had presented in a report with reference to the excesses of the Indian media and also the governmental constraints on the Indian media. Now, as I said in my opening, and this was a longish opening, but I just wanted to position this and some of the, give a gist of what Suchitra Vijayan said in that video. Since you research all this, how much of what she is saying do you think is apt?
Well, I think that in India, unfortunately, what we've seen is a hollowing out of the independent and free press. So because of that, there's a lot of voices that are lacking. So the media has a responsibility to report accurate and fairly.
Okay, but there are ways of looking at it. One is, for instance, when you have fascist governments, whether it was Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy or totalitarian governments around the world, or whether it was Soviet Union, where journalists, even when they wanted to speak truth, could not do so for various reasons. But what we are witnessing here and what Suchitra Vijayan is saying is that there is an unholy alliance between the RSS government and some of the anchors. And since television is big in India and they get lots of television ratings and the rest of it, that there is this unholy alliance, and that sort of puts a different construct on the whole idea of whether they are being forced by the government to do this or whether they're simply doing it because it gives them access and it also gets them ratings, and ratings translate into big money.
Well, I do think it comes back to the hollowing out of a free press, because as we've seen, the Indian state has manipulated the Indian independent media in terms of advertising, in terms of access, like you've said, and this has led to an increase in politicization of the media, which can also lead to what you are referring to.
Okay, let me hop over to Rua here. Rua, as a Kashmiri whose territory, whose homes and hearts have been occupied since 1947 and since August 5th, also annexed, and as a journalist, in both capacities, you have seen the musty underbelly of India and the facts about Indian democracy. So give me your reading of what Suchitra Vijayan is saying in that video, and I just gave the gist of that.
Right, Ejaz, it's not only about this time, present time situation of the press inside Kashmir. Inside Kashmir, press literally has never had any sort of freedom in terms of, writing or even the broadcast. No media has ever been free in Kashmir, and we have been seeing it for many decades now. And now this has started. The state has started to intimidate the media within mainland India that tries to speak against the fascist and the authoritarian government which is presently in India. So definitely what Suchitra is saying is very much apt, and it is true. It is practically right now India is using all its means to curb any sort of dissent within the mainland territory, and particularly with Kashmir. You have seen, but despite that, I would like to mention the highest recognition that the Kashmiri journalists recently got was the Pulitzer Prize that two of the journalists, and one from Jammu, two from Kashmir and one from Jammu, won recently.
I'm actually doing the second segment of this program is about that. But here's the thing. So Alia's argument is that there is hollowing out. In other words, what she's saying is that there are these pressures from the government, and so either journalists are self-censoring, or some of the more perhaps opportunistic ones are kind of towing the line and getting big money. So what Suchitra Vijayan is saying, and she used Rahul Kamal's name as a metaphor, but she said he's not the only one. These are the people who are actually very actively, presenting hate speech, presenting selective facts, inciting people against the Muslims in India also, in occupied Kashmir also. So I want your view on that, because you have done journalism in Delhi also, and you have worked with many of these names. Was this always like this, or there's a certain groundswell of this now?
Well, for Kashmiris to be working with the Indian main, media organizations, like you said, big names, it has been extremely difficult. We have to be very careful with what we say, what we write. We are always tamed. Our news stories are always tamed. Our ideas are always curbed. We are never allowed to write the way we would otherwise write if we were not Kashmiris. We are Muslims and we are Kashmiris, and then a plus point for me was that I'm a Kashmiri Muslim woman from a particular background. So it all adds up together to another level altogether, and the intimidation is our work creates, it threatens them, and they in turn threaten us later. There have been cases when they literally fired a lot of people, and there are still a lot of Kashmiri journalists who work in India, in many other parts of India, but they're always scared and they're always frightened. And within Kashmir, the journalists who work for, the Indian media, they're also never able to write the way they would actually write for an international organization. So if you see, there's a difference of terminology. A person who would write for an international organization, say AP or Reuters, would write a militant. Otherwise, the person who works for an Indian media outlet will deliberately have to, choose other words, because otherwise the copy would not go further. So these are the minute differences that one has to take care of. And like you said, the within Kashmir, it's a different scenario. Within India, it's a different scenario. Rahul Kanwal is just one example. I believe the entire media, national media of India, except for a very few people, it's a sizable amount, and we see those people are doing great work, but they are also being intimidated. They are being booked under laws, the draconian laws, like we saw in Kashmir recently. Masrat Zehra, 26-year-old photojournalist, was booked for a picture that was already published in some international organization. Now, on the other hand,
which she put on her Facebook, and they thought that this is... No, I agree, and there are some very honorable exceptions. Like, if I got his name right, Ravish Kumar, who does a program for NDTV Hindi, who's always been very discerning. But using perhaps the law of averages, most of the television anchors are now doing what Suchitra Vijayan says, journalism as genocide. But let me go back to Alia Iftikhar here. Alia, what Rua says, the minute differences of how you write your copy, what words you use. To me, as someone who was trained as a print journalist, as a newspaper man, the use of language, what kind of words we use or can use, is not something simple, because every word evokes a certain response. It's not a dead thing. It's a very live thing. So, give me your sense of, when you do research in terms of restrictions and the rest of it. Is the use of the language also part of that?
Well, language is, of course, extremely important. But I think what we're talking about is, like Rua said, is the different landscapes in which journalists are working. So obviously, if you have a free and independent media, they should be free to write and use whichever language that they please. Now, if you are facing, many pressures from state, from governments, then that seeps in, particularly when you're facing pressures from the top to, write a certain way. Otherwise, you might see legal lawsuits. You might see your advertising being pulled. You might see yourself lose a job. It means that, these journalists have to work within a different landscape just to be able to write.
Okay, so when you do research and, you're in contact with hundreds of journalists across Asia, what is the most effective way that the government can essentially pressure a publication? Is it through pulling out the advertisement? Is it through getting the owners, pressuring the owners to fire journalists? Is it to actually the threat of bodily harm? Of course, it can be singly or in tandem, but what's the most effective way that gets the media to actually capitulate?
Well, it's different in every country, but I would say, unfortunately, in India, we see all of the above that you've mentioned. There's risk of physical attacks. There's risk of journalists even being killed for their reporting. There's risk of news outlets losing their advertising and not having the financial capabilities to continue operating, and well as pressures from owners, And legal lawsuits, particularly, are something we're seeing, especially in just the past, month or so. We've seen an onslaught of legal cases that have been filed against journalists and editors.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Alia Iftikhar speaking with us. Let me go back to Rua Shah here. Rua, the situation now, of course, you're right. I mean, this is nothing new as such. But I think the intensity of this control has drastically increased. Of course, in occupied Kashmir, there are a number of factors that make it work like that, but also in mainland India.
It was not. It is not by default that any of this is happening. Neither in Kashmir was it ever so. Neither is it the same in India right now. It is a pattern and it is a design that the government has, institutionalized now to basically threaten. All those who say anything against the state. It is a totalitarian government, no different than what we see in Israel or other fascist governments, or what we have seen in the Nazi time. So definitely. Inside India, the situation of press is it's deteriorated already, and it is also created among the masses, which is basically what brings us to what media is, right? What is the how media creates the opinion, and it has successfully created an opinion among the masses about Kashmiris first, and then Muslims, and now it is coming to even their own liberal leftist groups that used to say anything against their own government. So that it started in a chronological order, and when we Kashmiris used to tell them our stories, they would always believe their media about that. Then they started basically putting the Indian Muslims on the red line, and now they have started to come after all those leftists, including recently the JNU students were also booked under the same laws that they earlier used only against Kashmiris, which is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act.
Okay, let me ask you a straight question. So, if you are a Muslim journalist based in Delhi or Mumbai or elsewhere, and you write about Kashmir, with a degree of objectivity. And if you are a Hindu journalist doing the same thing, would the Indian state respond to you in different ways? Or do you think the response is going to be the same?
I have lived through it, what you are asking me, basically. When I was working with the Indian organizations 2 years ago, I lived through this fear of, not being able to write what I actually want to write. I remember I was working from Srinagar, and it was 2016. There was an uprising after the killing of Burhan Wani, and we were asked, Kashmiri reporters within that agency were asked to report from Kashmir. And it was two of Kashmiri journalists who were reporting from Kashmir. And there was one more Kashmiri journalist, but he did not work with us in Delhi, so he was a reporter for that news agency from Kashmir. So he had that particular style of writing, which the agency was okay with. But me and my boss, we used to report the fact, I would like to say. But all the copies would get changed, and I remember I had to ask them that please remove my name from the copy, because I did not write it. This is entirely something different. While as if somebody else who is not a Muslim, who's not a Kashmiri, would write the same thing, first they will not write the same thing, because they will always have a different perspective of the same story, and they would report it in the way which favors the organization. And that is the difference. We tend to write the truth, and they always try to curb it. And it is not only for me. I believe even the most veteran journalists who have worked in Delhi or are still working now feel the fear. If you remember, Iftikhar Gilani was once arrested, and he spent 6 months in prison only because he has a relationship with a registered resistance leader Sayyid Ali Shah Gilani in Kashmir, and he's his son-in-law, so he had to pay the price, and he spent 6 months for the crime he never committed, and it was a very serious crime that he was accused of, and he was later acquitted of all the charges. But he was lucky to have all the press at that time.
That's what I wanted to. I'm happy you raised Iftikhar's issue, because when this happened, Iftikhar, in addition to his work in Kashmir, he was also reporting for me. I mean, for the Friday Times and also for Daily Times. But at that time, I recall that the media in Delhi, and there are lots of names that I can remember, who were squarely behind Iftikhar. But what we have seen now, for instance, after August 5th, the issue of lockdown and various other protests, and the Delhi Press Club, if I remember, was not prepared to host an event where some researchers wanted to present their findings of what was happening in occupied and annexed Kashmir. So it seems to me that over the years, a lot has changed as far as the Indian media's tone and tenor is concerned.
I believe if Iftikhar Gilani or anybody else for that matter would have been arrested in the same case today, or which is happening literally, nobody from the Indian media or anybody from that circle that supported Iftikhar Gilani at that time would come up and support this person at this time, because there is so much fear that there are chances that all of them will be booked, like, you know, they're literally booked like animals.
Yeah, that's exactly what my point was in terms of how things have changed. But thank you so much. That was Ruha Shah speaking with us. I'm also joined by Dr. David Lowe, who's a security analyst and expert in terrorism and security and human rights. And he joins me from Leeds University. Thank you, Dr. Lowe. Just to get you up to speed, we were talking about, there's a barrister, Suchitra Vijayan, who put out a video, a 12-minute video, in which she spoke about, since she's worked with the Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and Yugoslavia, she put out this video saying that what's happening in the Indian media and how some of the Indian media anchors are spewing hate. This is journalism as genocide, and she refers to these findings not just in relation to the Nuremberg trials, but also in relation to the findings of the Rwandan tribunal with reference to some Rwandan journalists who were also considered as war criminals. So I just want to get your read on this whole idea of journalism as genocide, of the responsibility of the media people in terms of presenting facts, or instead being pressured or happy to toe the line of a fascist government and you know, presenting facts selectively, and also presenting them in a way that incites the majority community against another minority community, which obviously is already feeling vulnerable.
Yeah, I think it's ironic because today is in Europe, victory in Europe Day, and of course that was the overthrow of the Nazi regime, and we only know too well how they use their media to basically just give the party line. And it looks like from 75 years we've seen in a number of countries over a number of years, sometimes things just don't seem to change. You have state broadcasters who will give the line of the government, but doesn't really give the truth. And I think it's quite sad what we're seeing in India, and certainly with the suppression of journalism in Kashmir. I mean, its press is now 142 out of 180 on the Global Press Freedom Index. I mean, that really is low, and I think what's dropped them in the rankings is the issue with the suppression of journalism in Kashmir. And it's really important we have a free press under freedom of expression, because they are the fourth estate. They're the ones that can hold governments to account and speak on behalf of the people. So I think it's quite sad that we're as you said, we're seeing like a genocide of journalism in India, and it's supposed to be one of the largest democracies.
Absolutely. But here's the thing, when someone is an ombudsman role, it can be an organization, it can be a government regulatory body, it can be civil society itself. There are a number of reports, critiques of how, for instance, the BBC or Sky or CNN or Fox have been presenting certain facts, what kind of language is being used, because language itself becomes very important in how you present a certain point of view or how you slant a view. But the problem with India, and once again I'll refer to Ms. Vijayan's video, is that the government itself, I mean, the space to actually criticize what the media is doing has shrunk to a point, because the media and lots of these people are actually towing the RSS government's agenda, and the voices that can actually criticize or point to the fact that this is being done are either being silenced or they simply don't have the space to say what they want to say.
This is important what you're saying, and the examples you're giving there. You can see a grading. I mean, you mentioned CNN, and you put a CNN report in front of President Trump, and he calls them fake news straight away. And then you mentioned the BBC and Sky News here, in particular with the UK. There's been criticism in how they've been handling the reporting of the coronavirus pandemic. And then, as you quite rightly point out, the whole point is with the media as a whole, be it printed press, and we know with printed press there can be owners of that printed press, and they'll have an angle. So there's certain newspapers that we purchase, we know what angle they come from. But when the state's starting to interfere to say what you can and cannot say, then you no longer have a freedom of the press. And I think this is a big concern. I think what's quite sad with this is, obviously I mentioned the coronavirus pandemic. A lot of news like this is getting lost. What's happening in Kashmir is getting lost. What's happening in different parts of the world by some states is just getting lost because we're focusing on this pandemic. But when states are starting to tell the press what to say and what not to say, then that is a big cause of concern for freedom of expression.
Absolutely. And I'm very happy that you pointed out the fact that this COVID-19 pathogen has actually put everything else on the back burner, including what India is doing in occupied and annexed Kashmir. Thank you so much. That was Dr. David Lowe speaking with us from the Leeds University. We'll take a short break and move from India to India's occupation and oppression of Kashmir and its peoples. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indo Special. As I said, we are going to move from India and journalism as genocide to the Indian occupied Kashmir. On 6th May, Indian occupation forces martyred Riaz Naiku, a young former maths teacher in occupied Kashmir, along with Adil, Naiku's associate. The 35-year-old Naiku had joined the resistance against India's illegal occupation in 2010 in the wake of unrest triggered by the killing of a teenage boy at Tufail Mattu. Mattu died when a tear gas shell hit him during a protest. 2 days before this, on 4th May, resistance fighters killed 6 security personnel of the Indian Army, including a colonel and a major. The occupation forces had tried to enter the house by forcing civilians to move in the front, using them as human shields. This is the response to India's brutal occupation of Jammu and Kashmir since 1947 and its illegal annexation of Jammu and Kashmir since 5th August 2019. The valley remains under lockdown since then, and the government has told the Indian Supreme Court that this is appropriate and for security reasons. Such is the situation in the valley that Associated Press won this year's Pulitzer for its photojournalism in occupied Kashmir, an award that got the shrieking banshees in Indian media to wail and froth from the mouth. Meanwhile, the Indian Met Department has started reporting weather in Gilgit-Baltistan and Muzaffarabad since 5th May. This is a development that needs to be immediately snubbed by Islamabad in no uncertain terms, because it is in complete violation of the UN resolutions and also the Shimla Agreement. To discuss these developments further, we have with us Dr. Farhan Mujahid Chak, who is an associate professor of international affairs at Qatar University and is also the author of Islam and Pakistan's Political Culture. I also have with me Muzammil Ayub Thakur, who is president World Kashmir Freedom Movement and founder of the Justice Foundation, Kashmir Institute of International Affairs. Muzammil, let me begin with you. So this is now, obviously, and this was going to happen, that there's going to be armed resistance against what we have seen since 5th August, which is adding to the existing repression and oppression. But what we have seen is that the Indian media and the Indian government is now once again putting the blame on Pakistan. Your reading of the situation?
It's funny that India's only reaction is ever to blame Pakistan. It's unfortunate that their scope is only to accuse their neighbors. But let's also remember the fact that Riaz Neku was not just a resistance leader or a resistance fighter. He was a brother, he was a son. And his father, with great admiration, with whatever great admiration I have for him, his father is at peace that his son has achieved martyrdom and went out to fight for a just cause. I think we also need to mention the fact that as you mentioned, the Pulitzer-winning trio that Kashmir had was, for some reason, the Indians couldn't digest it. And I think one of the reasons that they could not digest it is because the authors were, or the winners were called as Kashmiris, and some of the title pieces were about how Kashmir's independence was revoked. So that's also a pain in India's side. Now, when it comes to Pakistan, as usual, India will always critique Pakistan, that everything is instigated by Pakistan. Riaz Neku was a local boy. Adil was a local boy. And all the other boys, for example, Burhan Wani, Manan Wani, Sabzar, Saddam, all of these boys were indigenous young boys who came from the valley that were inside, and they faced persecution, oppression. They witnessed firsthand the issues inside occupied Kashmir, and they were forced, their backs were against the wall, and they were forced to pick up arms and weapons and then react. But I also want to mention at this point in time that there are so many ways that the Indian occupational forces and the Indian machinery clamps down on the people of Kashmir. And it's not just on those that resist with weapons. It is even those that resist by the pen. Masrat Zahra, Gauhar Gilani, Pirzada Ashik. So you have so many different examples of how the Indian state represses and oppresses the people of Kashmir. If yesterday it was Masrat Zahra, Pirzada Ashik, Gauhar Gilani, and today it was Burhan Wani, Manan Wani, the likes of them, and Riaz Neku. Tomorrow it could even be Muzammil Thakur.
Absolutely. I'm happy that you raised this point, Muzammil, because it clearly shows that India's approach is not simply, it's not just about responding to armed resistance. It is responding to anyone, regardless of what means is being used. It's a response that actually is oppressive, which wants to quell the truth. But let me go to Dr. Farhan Chak. Dr. Chak, give me your sense of the Pulitzer Prize that the Kashmiri trio got, which, AP's Pulitzer Prize, but it's the Kashmiri trio. The reaction that we saw on the Indian media would have been comical if there was not so much tragedy behind it.
I think you're absolutely right. And I agree entirely with Muzammil that the way that the Indian state has totally suffocated life and suffocated thinking, I would go as far as to say it's a thought control as much as it is physical military occupation. They cannot conceive and accept even the word Kashmir to be uttered away from India. And I think this brings us to their enragement when it came to the Pulitzer Prize, because specifically it mentioned that the area is contested. This is something that India has been previously, hitherto successful relatively, in obfuscating the reality and confusing world opinion. That is one of the most positive developments that's happened ever since August 5th. Nobody agrees the fact that this is an integral part of India. We need to insist and repeat this ad nauseum, that this is officially disputed territory, but for Kashmiris, India is occupying Kashmir. So this narrative change, this transformation of the narrative is really what they've been preventing. Their overreaction, and as you mentioned, it is comical. The levels, and it's actually not even comical, I would go as far as to say, Mr. Ijaz, it's pathological.
Absolutely.
India's fear, absolute fear of everything from Pakistan and fear of an identity that is Kashmiri owned away from India is what terrifies it. And this is understanding the psychology of, understanding the psychology of the oppression and the subjugation. But their response makes them look even more foolish, makes them look even more ludicrous in the eyes of world opinion. So these are all positive developments. And I frankly think that aside from this fake calmness that leadership in India tries to project, it is totally panicking because the way that they've tried to cover up their atrocities and crimes have never been exposed as they are now. See, I just wanted to quote here, United Nations Resolution 37/43, December 3, 1982. It reaffirms the legitimacy of the struggle of people for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial, foreign domination, and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle.
Absolutely. I'm very happy you mentioned this. And as a matter of fact, there are resolutions that also say that such people can get external help also. But I'm very happy you talked about the pathology of this. I remember this is, a couple of decades ago, at a conference in Delhi, I made this point about India's desire to be, a desire to project power and to be a big power, but unfortunately retaining the pathology of a small power. Since you deal with international affairs, do you think that this has something to do with the fact that India was constantly conquered by conquerors who came from the West, and that has managed to instill the pathology of a small power in India, and their aspiration to play a role and project power also sort of emanates from that?
It absolutely is a pathology. I have just finished an academic article on this. I actually trace it to contested identity. Ever since the creation of both Pakistan and India, India has been unwilling to accept the creation of Pakistan, and there is a pathology behind it. You see, Winston Churchill said India is as much a country as the equator. There is no such thing as India. And they've been working very hard to push and create even as much as usurping Mohenjo-daro, usurping the Indus civilization, false associations with Taxila and Gandhara. None of this is true. We should have done better in kind of academically, intellectually confronting this myth that everybody was Hindu, the Muslims came, forced them to become Muslim, and they've separated Mother India. At the heart of the pathology is this myth that there was one India that was
I would actually love to read this. I would love to read this article. But let me go back to Muzammil here because I have to wrap up the segment also. Muzammil, I talked about, in my opening, I talked about the Indian Met Department actually, forecasting weather in Gilgit-Baltistan and Muzaffarabad. And I also said that Islamabad needs to, in no uncertain ways, snub this, because if it goes unchecked, then it becomes part of state practice under international law. Give me a sense of how do you think Pakistan should react to this?
Look, with the issue of COVID-19 and the coronavirus shutting down most international offices, including the United Nations, but it does not mean that there is no power corridor work that is happening. I think Pakistan needs to take this issue back to the United Nations and make sure that they understand what a disputed territory is, remind them of the United Nations resolutions. But here's the issue, Ejaz. Irregardless of all the laws, all the human rights laws that have been broken, all the crimes that India have committed inside Kashmir, abrogating Article 370, killing, lynching, murder, this is public knowledge. Do we really expect the international community, particularly the United Nations, to intervene when it comes to the issue of Gilgit-Baltistan, Balochistan, raw intervention in these regions, trying to incite radicalism and terrorism in these regions? Do we really expect the international community to actually combat Indian terror across the border, when the Indian international community didn't even intervene during the times of occupation, during the times of lynchings and murder and rape and enforced disappearances and draconian laws and genocide and ethnic cleansing and war crimes and crimes against humanity? The list is endless, Ejaz. We cannot expect anything from the international community.
Absolutely.
So it's time that Pakistan takes matters in our own hands.
Yeah, but Muzammil, as Dr. Farhan Chak said, there is now, the Pulitzer, how it was titled, the kind of reaction that it got. So there is now slowly, things are accumulating, and I think this is the space which the Kashmiris and which Pakistan, in support of Kashmiris, can exploit. But thank you so much. I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Farhan Chak for mentioning his upcoming article. I'd love to read that. Thank you, Muzammil, as always, for your insights. This is it from Indus Special for this week. We shall see you next Thursday at the same time. For latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.